So welcome everybody. My name is Dan Smith. I'm the director of the Africa Initiative at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And I'm going to introduce our speaker today, who is Hassan Kochore. Hassan is a PhD candidate at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. He holds a bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of Nairobi and a master's in African studies from Oxford University. And he's currently writing up his dissertation, which I believe this talk is drawn from. The title of the talk is Do Locals Count? State Documentation and Illegible Temporalities in Northern Kenya. It's a real pleasure to have Hassan here today. He's going to speak for about 45 minutes or so. The PowerPoint is being controlled by Ellen here at Brown because we had a little bit of a technological glitch. So Hassan will request when he needs the PowerPoints forwarded. And then at the end of the talk, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And because it's a webinar format, people can post their questions and answers in the Q&A slot at the bottom of the Zoom function. And we'll hopefully have some lively questions, comments, and conversation at the end. So Hassan, welcome, and thank you for being with us today. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dan, for hosting me. And earlier as well, who I'm sure is on the audience, for inviting me to give this talk today. So as has pointed out, this is a fraction of my PhD thesis, which generally looks at aging in northern Kenya. So it takes age and aging as an experience to look, in order to study multiple temporalities engendered by a myriad of factors, social, political, and other demographic sort of issues. The title of my thesis itself is Government. So government, cultural resilience, and entangled temporalities in northern Kenya. Government is a kind of is a capsule of a word, if I may put it that way, because it looks at it incorporates gather, which is a traditional age grading system, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, and ment is essentially the latter part of government, to try to kind of encapsulate the different kind of temporalities that I'm trying to talk about. So the local and the government or state kind of induced temporalities, if I may put it that way. So the question of today's talk, do the locals count, is essentially supposed to be a provocative one, in the sense that, I mean, do the locals actually have the capability to count numerically? But also it's metaphorical, because it looks at the place of northern Kenya and its inhabitants in the larger social and political history and historiography of northern Kenya. So I'll start this talk with a vignette from a village in northern Kenya, where I did my PhD fieldwork quite a while ago now, 2017, 2018. So when I arrived at this particular village, where I was a constant visitor, one evening, I found B, my interlocutor, whose name I would not like to reveal at this point, just sitting outside the compound, presumably winding down the day as she kind of watched the goings on in the vicinity. So there was a stream of people on that particular day going through our compound to access the main road that connects, a cluster of houses in one of these villages. So as I approached her and we exchanged the usual niceties, Bor was occasionally distracted by greetings from mostly elderly people going through the village. So I asked her what exactly was going on, because it was a bit of an unusual street. And so she mentioned that it was a group of old men, mainly old men, who are going to receive their bi-monthly cash transfer, which is basically a cash transfer for the elderly by the Kenyan government, but also supported by other local and international NGOs. I wasn't prepared for what would follow next, because I posed a rather innocent question to B and asked, do you also go to get these cash payments? And it was as if she had anticipated this question, because she immediately launched into a kind of a grievance on why she was told that she doesn't qualify. Apparently because she had not reached the eligibility age of 70 years. Something that she was resentful about anyway, because she says that her sister, who is younger than her, actually receives the money, even though, of course, she's younger than her. But apparently, she was older in terms of her ID card. So in the eyes of the government, she had reached the 70-year-old, while B, who is the older of the siblings, did not qualify. And so I was left with some uncomfortable questions, because Bor asked me why her younger sister qualified and she didn't. So I said, I don't know, but presumably it's because maybe on paper she's not eligible. So she presented me with her ID card, which read that she was born in 1952. So basically in 2017, she still was not 70 years old, which is the age at which, the age at which one qualifies for the cash transfer program. And so this puzzle basically forms the kind of foundation for my talk, because I'm interested in how ID cards fail in these kind of instances to identify people correctly. I mean, this is not a particularly idiosyncratic sort of situation with northern Kenya. I mean, ID cards can fail anywhere because of different kind of technical challenges, like we had with our slides today. Because, I mean, if the chip, kind of electronic chip fails, then, it has failed to identify you. But what I'm interested in is, how does the failure occur? And this talk basically locates this question of how ID cards fail in the context in which I've just described. What are the kind of the historical and political processes that lead to this kind of failure? And so I will try to kind of take you through the colonial epoch and how some of these errors were reproduced because of the nature of the state in these peripheral areas. So the kind of literature that I draw on here are two main strands. So the kind of legibility school that is mainly based on the work of James Scott, who says that the idea of the state is to make people legible And for example, the creation of surnames and databases about other biographical kind of details is essentially to be able to identify people and their addresses and so on and so forth, which essentially makes them visible to the state for surveillance reasons or whatever other reasons. And the second kind of strand that I pull in this particular framing is the subjectivity kind of school, where the main or the foundational kind of text here is Foucauldian in a sense, where the argument is basically that documents not only identify people, but engenders different kind of subjectivities. The relationship with the state, individuals and the state, for example, so to speak, the political subjectivities. So I try to show how ID cards then, as a tool of the state, not only identifies people and makes them visible to the state, but also engenders other kind of idiosyncratic subjectivities in individuals and group of individuals and other categories of people. So Eleni, if we can have the slide now. So this quote is from an article, a recent article by a friend of mine, where it says that the reason, the reason subjects are basically enrolled into legible temporality, or the natives are kind of registered by the state, is because they're illiterate. And he says illiteracy demands special treatment. So the native, cannot read or write, and lacks a physical address. And sometimes, the local naming customs also confuses basically the kind of normative assumptions of age and names according to the state, as it were. So that's probably one of the fundamental reasons registration was undertaken, is to make the native visible at all times to the omnipotent or omnipresent rather state. And so that's why so if we can go to the next slide again. You have also this kind of bias in northern Kenya, where populations were always suspected of kind of illegal dealings. So essentially, incorporating them into kind of a legible temporality also ensured that they fall in line with the legality of the state. So this quote is, for example, by one district commissioner handing over to the other, who passed on this piece of wisdom, saying that in northern Kenya, or the Northern Frontier District, everything is illegal unless it is specifically authorized in writing. So you can see where I'm going with this, that this is a temporal kind of society that needs to be recruited into a legible temporality, basically, through documentation and writing. And this is kind of reflected in the official discourse at the time. So the next slide, please. The Northern Frontier Districts is landmass of like almost half of the Kenyan state for kind of orientation, cartographic orientation. So you're dealing with a lot of landmass, but also quite sparsely populated. So that's why there's this balkanization where you have documents that tie people to these particular areas called the NFD. And so there was essentially a kind of regime of laws that was specific to this particular region that were intended to sort of cut off these populations from the rest of Kenya. So from the very beginning, the kind of written documentation and laws operating in this particular region was quite different from the rest of the country. And I will kind of try to show that throughout the rest of the time that we have. So in the next slide, I'll just briefly talk about the history of state documentation, which essentially started with this piece of identity card that you see on your screens, which is a kipande chain. Kipande meaning basically a piece in Swahili, or like a small kind of booklet, you know, that you can see here. So the initial kipande registration was started in 1915 through the Native Registration Ordinance, and it was mainly issued to men who were 16 years old, and it was specifically for a recruitment into labor force. So any, you know, young man who is 18 years old is considered to be able-bodied and can work. So was issued with this identification called kipande. And so it had details of the name and place of birth and so on, but also it had a signature of the employer. So whenever somebody is employed, then, you know, the employer signs and indicates the amount of money that the person earns and so on and so forth. But also it was a disciplining tool in the sense that unless the master has signed off that this particular laborer left his current job, you know, in good terms, then they will never sign off. So essentially that means that they will not be employed by anybody unless they have a favorable relationship with their previous employer. And so kipande was much loathed in the Kenyan historiography. It's kind of replete with, you know, all sorts of grievances about kipande, which also had a chain, by the way, that people used to hang around their necks. And so, yeah, it was like a very, you know, colonial kind of document, if we may put it that way. But the interesting thing that, as far as I have looked, there is not any evidence of the use of kipande in northern Kenya. And that's partly tied to the nature of, you know, the colonial state in that region, because there were no laborers, I mean, required to do plantation work and other things in northern Kenya. The only laborers who were recruited for doing menial jobs like working on the roads and so on and so forth. And for this, I didn't see any documentation. So unlike in, you know, the central Kenya and other parts where laborers worked on brook-borne, you know, tea plantations, for example, in northern Kenya, there was not particularly any kind of colonial investment that demanded that kind of labor. The only labor is for maintaining basic infrastructure. And so I guess that's partly why the kipande did not feature in that particular part of the world. But the North did not miss its own forms of documentation. As we can see in the next slide, it was closed for business, and anybody who went into northern Kenya required a pass from the rest of the country. So if you're coming in or going out, you always needed documentation. You had to go to the local chief, the district commissioner, you know, to authorize your visit, based on, of course, your own presentation of the intentions of visiting that place. So while us, we didn't have, or in northern Kenya didn't have kipande or that kind of, you know, intense personal documentation, there was a kind of regional requirement for people to have these papers whenever they went in and out. However, there were locals who were issued with the passbook rather than a kipande. And so in the next slide is an image of a passbook that was issued to one of the local traders, whose name I hope does not appear here. But you can, if you look closely, you can see some of the details, because it was issued in 1969 and it was valid until June of 1970. And this person is a hides and skin trader, and so on and so forth. So these passbooks here were quite ubiquitous in northern Kenya for, you know, people of kind of importance, local or otherwise, who used to come in and go out. But passbook was not necessarily tied to northern Kenya. If you see in the next slide, there is a whole book called Passbook, written by someone called Muthoni Likimani. But passbooks, and this one used to be a passbook which was issued in Nairobi. But this one is different from the northern Kenya passbooks in the sense that it was only introduced during the emergency in 1952 or thereabouts, and it was used until the end of at independence, basically, which was 1963. So you can see how the rest of the country was also sort of evolving towards some of the draconian kind of measures that were put in place in northern Kenya. One of the things in Kenyan historiography is that the intense focus on central Kenya, and particularly the period between 1952 to 1960, where a lot of studies on the Mau Mau insurgency basically looks at that particular era and places things like passbook in that particular epoch. But if you look closely to other regions, you know, some of these things were in place, you know, much earlier. And one of the things that life histories reveal is that people do remember, you know, the colonial government in a very personal and intimate way, unlike, you know, what the historiography portrays, that, you know, northern Kenya is just a landmass. There were, you know, people who were locked in and so on and so forth. They had minimal contact with the state, as it were. You know, the British were there only to kind of provide Pax Britannica, sort of, you know, peace, so that, you know, these tribes can exist in peace or can coexist in harmony and so on and so forth. But this ignores, you know, the level of idiosyncratic engagements of particular individuals. And I argue that, you know, looking at these kind of documentations give you a sense of the political subjectivities in these places. And this should not just be read through the colonial archives and, you know, memoirs from British colonial officials, but a closer look at the rank and file members of the society could also shed some light on these particular historical issues. So if we move to the next slide. So what I mean by, individual idiosyncratic engagements with the state that shapes their own sort of political subjectivity is looking at ways in which people themselves reckon time and place themselves, or ways of being in the world that is not just about the state-induced, Gregorian calendar sort of ways of looking at time. One of these systems is the age grading systems, where a number of people of a particular age are put together in the same grade. So, for example, among the Borana and the larger Oromo communities that are found in northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia, the age grading system is called Gada. So Gada essentially puts all members of the society, particularly male members of the society, who are within, 1 to 8 years and variables of that. So 1 to 8 years, for example, is called Dabale, that's the childhood. The next one, 8 to 16, is the adolescence. 16 to 24 is junior warriorhood, and so on and so forth. I like to share this image because a lot of people who study Gada don't necessarily like it because it presses a lot of information into one slide. But I think it's a good one because usually it depends on the kind of question that you have and approach this particular image with it rather than just looking at it, hoping to decipher something. So in this case, if you look at the outer sort of ring, then it kind of shows you the particular age grades. And so essentially time is kind of sliced into 8-year periods, if you like. And I've had Varane explain to outsiders that every 8 years, is like a term of a president. And so the president is the name of the Abagada of that particular age grade. I can go into more details if people want to talk about it more. But Gada essentially is a very strong system of time reckoning that has stood the test of time, if I may put it that way. Hence my title, cultural resilience. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to show you how the state documentation kind of intersects with this traditional understanding of time. So particularly people's age. So people understand their age through, especially the elderly, the demographic that I'm interested in, who have not, gone to school. They are sort of illiterate in the Western sense of the term, but of course they have their own ways of reading. But the argument then is that when state documentations come in and superimposes itself on such a system, it kind of glosses over some of these issues. And the problem with that is you end up with a predicament like the one that I described in the opening vignette, where people are not as old as they supposedly are on the ID card. And this is a direct result of the state superimposing itself on this kind of system without necessarily taking it into account. So can we have the next slide, please? So this is the Gada chronology. So what has happened here is that Gada has basically been converted into the Gregorian calendar. So you have the particular periods listed on the right-hand side, and the names of the particular presidents or Abagada, as it were, on the left-hand side. So it has been extrapolated to include almost 200 years or thereabouts. But the period I'm interested in is in the next slide. Basically, the period from 1921 to now, there's one Abagada that is missing up there. But the period between 1921 and 2017, during my fieldwork, covers the life histories of some of the individuals I talked about. So, for example, when I asked one of my interlocutors, Wiyoma Licha Roba, I mean, I say some of the names of the elderly people as a tribute to them, but also after I explained what I was up to, they were happy that I do not anonymize them, otherwise people would not know their wisdom, but also they were just happy to share their own biographies, as it were. So when I asked Mr. Roba how old he was, he said he is Dambal Arero, which is one of the age grades that I previously tried to show. But also what that means is that he says he was born in the Gada of Arero Gedo. So from, if you look at the next, no, sorry, not this next slide, but if you look at the left-hand side, you can see the last name on that is Arero Gedo. So essentially, this person was born between 1921 and 1929. But he will not tell you the details I'm telling you about 1921 and 1929. He will leave it at that. So he will tell you is that he was born in the Ghetto of Arero Gedo. But if you probe further, then you might be able to get, like, you can ask how many years, for example, into the Ghetto of Arero Gedo. So if he tells you, for example, that it was 3 years into that particular Ghetto, then you will know it's 1924 straight away. So and there are a lot of examples where people give you these dates, as it were, with precision. So it's not like people didn't know or they were illiterate, as you know, we saw the quote from the district commissioner in the opening stages of this talk, that people didn't actually know, and you know, illiteracy demands special treatment. It can never be, there's never been, you know, a more misguided talk. And it's unfortunate that this is the kind of discourse. This is basically how people are assigned random ages. And in the records, it says that some of the dates are NPR, so ages of people are not properly recorded. That's what they capture, but actually they go on to ascribe, you know, an approximate. They just look at people and say, okay, this one is maybe 15, 20 years, and so on and so forth. Which was fine. It worked as an identification tool. It worked. But now it's failing because people are underage or, you know, overage. And when you look at now contemporary government programs, then you capture the wrong sort of beneficiaries. I don't like the word beneficiaries that much, but so yeah, if you target people 70 and above, and if you use the ID card only as a way of determining the age, then essentially you have the wrong people enrolled for the program, and this has caused a lot of resentment. I have a few more examples, but one thing I'd like to point out next is, on the next slide, is also people remembered Gada in other ways. For example, Rio Adimolu, who says he was born in a place called Borbor in Ethiopia. His memory is quite sharp because he said it's in Harodaye. If there are any Ethiopianists or Ethiopians in the audience, they might be able to locate the specific place. But if you also know more about the area, you can locate the specific place he was born, because he insisted I write it down. He said it's at the bottom of Gar Sarifo. The reason I recount this is because I want to show how basically, people remember Gada not only through the framework of Gada itself, but by also incorporating state structures. So if you look at the image on the screen, is essentially, which district commissioner was in Marsabit at what particular time. I got this image from the DC's office of course, I sought permission. But I didn't know that I was going to use it in this way. It's only after revisiting some of my interviews that I realized people actually mentioned that. So Guyo Adi tells me that his first ID card, he says he obtained during the colonial period, of course, but I'm not sure what kind. There's some kind of myth-making here as well, where people want to show that they have been around for long enough because of issues of state surveillance and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing that, Guillaume Adimoru told me that he paid to a man called Nyenjo in the local parlance. He paid Nyenjo 6 years of tax. So before Nyenjo left, basically, for 6 years, this person was in Marsabit. What that means, if Nyenjo, when I kind of looked through colonial memoirs and archival documents, is someone called Mr. Wild. So Nyenjo is also kind of related to Wild in the sense that, it's a lion and kind of, so the name itself is quite telling in that sense. But Mr. Wild was in a district commissioner in Marsabit between 1951 and 1959. If you look closely, you might not be able to see that quite easily. But there's W.A. Wild somewhere between 1951 and 1959. And so when this person says he paid tax to this DEC for 6 years before he left, then you can do your maths quite easily. So 1959 minus 6 is 1953. So essentially, that's when this person came to Marsabit from Ethiopia. So you can see it's 1956. And of course, he knows also the Gada in which he was born. But then the thing is, if you look at his ID card, it's completely different. It has a different age if you calculate, and the range of errors sometimes is like 4, 5, 6 years, sometimes 10 years. And so essentially, in the current context, what it means then is that there's a production of underage elders in government record. So you have all these statistics saying there are people over 70 years old in the census in Marsabit are a particular age. But I mean, you can see the discrepancies, and so the reliability of this kind of data is all thrown into question, if you like. So essentially, the government is targeting the wrong demographic for the wrong programs. That's my argument. But apart from that, if we go to the next slide, there's also the gender aspect, where women are never issued with identity cards anywhere, including central Kenya, anywhere in Kenya for that matter, until in the post-independence era in 1978 is the time when women started getting ID cards. But the issue with ID cards of older women in Marsabit, and I presume other places, is that some of the women were already married. So, you know, they were recruited for ID cards by their own husbands. And what happens is that the husband sometimes present, you know, random numbers as their age, as long as, you know, they don't risk giving themselves away as having married underage girls. So, you know, and so this particular quote, "We do not write ID cards," was given to me by another elderly person who said that, you know, she doesn't know what age is indicated, but she actually knows her own age. And the reason is because, you know, it's not her who actually got the ID for herself. But there's other aspects to ID cards as well, where politicians also, because of their, you know, quest for votes, enroll people for ID cards and so on and so forth. One of the things is that with the names on ID cards for women, it's quite different from that of men, in the sense that they bear the name of the husbands. So if a woman is called Bokayo, for example, then, and her husband is called Boro, on the ID card you find Bokayo Boro. But this is not normal, because women usually do not take their husband's name once they get married, you know, in Kenya. They usually retain their names. And this is one of the most striking sort of anomalies on ID cards. And it was quite telling, you know, when this elderly lady told me that they don't write ID cards, then, you know, it's like, yeah, other people do it for them. And it's quite revealing, some of the details that appear on it. And I'm happy to discuss some of these issues in more detail in the Q&A. I should be wrapping up in the next few minutes. But one of the things is that in the postcolonial period, much as, you know, there are all these kind of errors that occur because of the nature of registration, there were attempts to rectify some of these issues. So Marsabit, for example, was made a compulsory registration area in 1991. But despite some of these efforts, still the registration was centralized in the headquarters. And, you know, for a vast region like that, then it doesn't reach many people. So you still have a lot of home births that are not registered, and hence, I mean, still you have up to date, you have young people who do not know their specific age, partly because their, you know, births were not recorded properly. So the point is that it's not just an old people's problem. It's an ongoing issue, some of which is being remedied in different ways, particularly in these times of decentralized government in Kenya. Those who are familiar with the process of devolution and, you know, the multiplication of political players at the local level, where they have become activists for, you know, recruiting people for ID cards for obvious reasons. I mean, because they want the votes themselves. So this kind of situation is changing, but these errors keep being reproduced until now. So yeah, and that brings me to the conclusion of this particular talk, where we started with, you know, the whole concept of legibility, making people legible, the state having the ability to do this. But of course, in the Africanist context, it has been argued that, for example, by Jeffrey Hubst, that the further you go away from the center, the weaker sort of the state becomes. And I think you can see that through the way in which the state misreads or makes illegible people or, you know, populations in some of these peripheral areas. And so that kind of ties to the title illegibility. So they create kind of creates a level of opacity where the original intention was to shed light on particular aspects of the population. And with that, I would like to thank you for your audience and for keeping up with my really quick talking because of the amount of text that I have had to go through. But thank you very much, and I'll be really happy to answer some of your questions and receive feedback generally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hassan. I will keep track of what's coming in the Q&A and feed them to you so you can just concentrate on formulating what you want to say. We have one question already from Dale Abraham, which says, are there cases where people who understand these ambiguities have exploited them in their favor, late retirements, informal engagements, for example, in employment? So in other words, are people able to kind of navigate the system and make these errors work in their favor?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Thanks, Dale, and thanks for tuning in. Dale is a friend of mine from Marsabit itself, so it's quite nice to know that there are people who are listening from Marsabit. Yes, this is a very topical issue. There are cases where people have changed their own ID cards to adjust their names downward, I mean their age downwards. So people who have, attained the retirement age of 60, when they turn 55, basically go and change their ID. And this is a manipulation of the system that is made possible partly by the fact that the registration was not, the system was not foolproof in the sense that, there was fingerprinting and all that, but there's not like biometrical information that is stored. And so this kind of issue, manipulation is widespread. Although these days now, because we have, Huduma number, which is essentially one document that centralizes all the identifications that are attributable to one person. So the end, like insurance, driving license, national ID are all put in one place, but it's also digitized. And so it's really hard to manipulate now. The room for manipulating is getting smaller and smaller. And there are issues about this in refugee camps, particularly in Dadaab, where a lot of Somalis were recruited as refugees in the camps, but they actually said that they are not refugees, they are Kenyan citizens who were recruited wrongly or enrolled in the refugee sort of list wrongly. And so that presents a whole lot of problems, and it's a very pertinent issue. And I think it's going to Parliament in the next few days. I've seen somewhere that Taden Duale, who is one of the members of Parliament from that region, kind of putting in a petition to say that some of these refugees are actually Kenyans and they should be kind of their information should be expunged from the list. So yeah, this is a very important question, and you can see how it in the contemporary times. There are people who have done that kind of research recently. So yeah, thanks, Dali.
So Alia has a series of questions. I'll read her post. Dear brother friend Hassan, thank you for this excellent presentation. I cannot wait to read the full dissertation and the book. A few questions to get us started. One, are there ways that elderly Kenyans are making themselves count amidst ideization? Two, how does being classified or categorized according to IDs transform social relations and the flow of things across generations and in society more generally? And three, finally, I'd love to hear you reflect on how old school forms of identifying and counting, IDs, are intersecting with new forms of identifying and counting, e-government systems, an initiative that is at the center of our current government's development agenda.
Thank you so much, Alia. Yeah, I mean, it's the whole point is just to show how there's this kind of marginalization of not only a region northern Kenya, but also a whole demographic of elderly people. But one thing is that they're making themselves count, or they're being made, relevant in new ways. So of course you have international organizations also, like, Help Age International, for example, that has been doing a lot of activism trying to counter ageism in different manifestations of it. And this is a new phenomenon because Help Age International is quite a recent organization in that part of the world. So there are other examples as well of organizations that are targeting particularly the elderly people. And of course, the Constitution of Kenya also has new provisions on some of these issues related to the older people. So there, despite the historical kind of marginalization and so on and so forth, there are efforts today that are trying to help to ameliorate some of these things. Social relations across generation. That is something that I might have to think about. But all school ways in which people counted and the way it intersects with the contemporary sort of classifications of, and ways of recording data, the biometrics particularly. It would be really interesting once we have, I think this can only be addressed in a meaningful way once we have the data on the Huduma. So at the moment, I think the first sort of cards are coming out of for the biometric registration. And so once maybe, a significant amount of people have been captured in this biometric system, which is particularly problematic for different reasons, especially because of elections and privacy issues. How do you capture people without having laws in place that is going to protect their personal information and so on and so forth. But the long and short of it is that in the next maybe few months we'll be able to know what different categories of people have been enrolled in this system, and maybe some of the challenges that has resulted, has come about as a result of different ways of the old school ways, as you put it, kind of intersects with this new generation of biometric identification systems. We'll pick up on some of these issues in our other conversations with Alia, so I'd like to leave it at that at this point.
Great. So Hassan, I have a few questions while we wait to see if others get posted in the Q&A. I guess I wanted to follow up a little bit on Dolly's question, and particularly about the sort of I don't know if it's an irony, but I'll call it an irony that ID cards and surveillance by the government and so on is about, as you note, this process of making citizens legible, turning them into citizens, but then wondering whether in the context of what you're describing with the cash transfers and the misrecognition of people's correct ages and them becoming ineligible for things maybe they should be eligible for, whether or not there's a conscious, purposeful process of leaving people illegible or invisible, and the dynamic is reversed, that citizens are trying to make themselves seen and legible by the state. I mean, because when you said that, I just want to contextualize that question a little bit more. You gave the impression that the mismatch between the Gada system and the kind of government counting of ages led to a constant underestimate of people's ages. But I didn't understand why that would be the case unless it was purposeful, because it seems to me the Gada system is randomly cutting off at 8 years, and half of the people who would be misrecognized would be misrecognized as older than they are, and half of the people who would be misrecognized as younger than they are. But you suggested they were kind of more systematically recognized as younger. And so I was wondering if that was true, and if so, whether that was indicative of some purposeful strategy on the state's part to have to pay fewer, less cash transfers.
That's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, so the thing is, you're looking at different regimes. So the ID cards were issued in 1970s. Is a different. The state had a different character at the time. So Northern Kenyan. So if I may go back in time a little bit, there was an insurgency just at independence. So in 1963. Kenya gained independence and people became citizens as opposed to subjects. But in the same year, in December, state emergency was declared in Northern Kenya because of, the kind of insurgency that broke out where people say they don't want to be part of the new republic. So essentially, the registration exercise did not happen in the same way that it happened in other places. So for obvious reasons, this is, a kind of, if I put it this way, direct exclusion of certain types of citizens, the Northerners particularly. But when they came in, so to issue the ID cards 15 years later, there were all these kinds of biases and prejudices that, new government officials moved in with. So Northerners are not to be trusted. Most of them are just, refugees or, people coming in through the borders, particularly because they inhabit these border regions. So the attitude cannot be, excluded from the process of registration. And so all the officials were never locals. There were people from other places, and they were not interested in Ghana. So when I try to compare it that way, I don't try to show that the state officials actually deliberately did anything to overestimate or underestimate, because they didn't have a reference point. They were not interested in these local ways of counting. So it's just random estimation. But by chance, I don't know why everybody's younger, like at least in my examples, than they are is maybe telling of how, these officials, the prejudices they had. So it's nothing systematic. It cannot be put into any kind of rational system to say why they did this, but I guess it's just very subjective kind of political orientation of particular individuals. It's that, random. It doesn't, there's no rationale or logic, at least that I can discern from my data, if that gestures, towards any kind of answer to your question.
No, absolutely. I mean, I might follow up, but we have some more questions in the chat, so I want to move to those. So, and I'll apologize to people if I mispronounce names, but from Halkano Buru, will the Huduma card have any ramification on those whose IDs, who don't ID in Northern Kenya?
Thanks, Halkano, as well. I guess tuning in from the neighboring county of Isiolo, if I'm not wrong. Does it have any on people who do not have, or this? I think there's a word that might be missing.
What it says is on those who don't IDS in Northern Kenya. I don't know what IDS means.
IDS is IDs, I presume, but so the question maybe Alkano is trying to ask is, what about those who don't have the IDs or something like that? If I just fill in the the missing word. I mean, this is the kind of exclusion we are talking about. So if people didn't have IDs, because the state was not interested in issuing Northerners with IDs, there's always a layer of, there's vetting that doesn't happen in a lot of places. So extra vetting. So you have to produce, or you have to go to the chief. There's actually a vetting committee of village elders, chiefs, and I think also the county commissioner's office representative these days. And so a lot of people actually don't have IDs, and this is, a big problem, has been, and even more so now, because of all this digitization, there will be the risk of leaving a whole, lots of people out of it. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm sure the Uduma number is only issued to people who already have IDs. Those who don't have will still face another kind of round of exclusion. And this is the whole point, it's exclusion and inclusion of people into these kind of legible systems, temporalities. But I mean, it has other ramifications as well of denying people services and so on and so forth. Yeah, so Uduma and biometric registration adds a new layer of complexity that we can talk about the whole evening, I guess.
So we have a series of questions from Miriam Kalimo. Miriam, it's great to have you here. So this is what she writes. Thanks for a great talk. As a Kenyan, this was very exciting to listen to. She has 3 questions. The first is, I've noticed a lot of older people, for a lot of older people, the date of birth is listed as 0101XXX, my grandmother included. Any thought about using this date? What do your interlocutors say about this form of dates? Then the second question is, how do your interlocutors think about Huduma number? And the third is a comment about women in Kenya not having husbands' names in IDs. That's actually not always the case everywhere in Kenya. Some women do go and change their IDs to their husbands' names after marriage. Usually if women do get IDs before marriage, that's when they have their maiden names, but some choose to change after marriage, unless I got you wrong, or were you referring specifically to Marasabat?
That's interesting. So I have seen 000XX. I mean, that's the whole point, right? It doesn't say when this particular person was born and how old they are. But from what I saw, some people had, there's kind of records that show that on the ID card itself, they say it's NPR. So the date of birth is not properly recorded. But in their own database, or like some of the copies I at least was able to see, of course I cannot divulge some of this information, but the thing is that it's XX on the ID itself. But in the counterfoil, or yeah, like the piece of paper that the registration officer retains, there's a random date, an approximation that has been put, which is not revealed on the ID card itself, which is essentially the kind of opacity that I'm talking about here. So the government knows that Dan is 50 years old, but on Dan's ID card, it doesn't say so. So yeah, it's legible to the state, but the person doesn't actually know how they are seen by the state. And in terms of women, yeah, of course. I mean, this is a very, I think it's Muslim sort of practice that women keep. I mean, they say that Muslim women are kind of oppressed by the patriarchy and so on, which is totally true in a lot of contexts. But also the kind of freedoms that people have with small things, I mean, quote unquote, like keeping their own names and so on. Like, I mean, my wife doesn't change her ID card, to read Maimuna Hassan in Kochore. No, they keep their identities. And this is a very quintessentially sort of Muslim practice, but also, at least in my experience, among Kushites. So in other parts of Kenya, it's totally, yeah, I mean, acceptable that women change their names at marriage, including on their own marriage certificates. I even know a friend of mine who had to change, her names on the publications that she does. And it's kind of confusing because you have publications from previous years that said you particular, had a different surname. And then now you're married, then you're publishing under a new name, and that kind of creates a bit of confusion in that sense. But yeah, I mean, it's not, I'm not by any chance trying to say that this is, I mean, the whole of Kenya. But for Huduma number among the elderly, I don't know their reaction generally, because the recruitment of different this, you know, ID card has never been so important in the way it's ubiquitous on a daily basis. Because on one hand, you know, there are all this registration for this kind of cash transfer programs, either for the elderly or for, you know, drought and famine programs. And then, of course, you have elections now. Kenya's, you know, going, you know, into another election in the next, next year. And so there's a whole lot of registration of voters and, you know, this Huduma number going on. And so there's a lot of confusion. People actually sometimes don't know what they are being recruited into, because the elderly cannot differentiate voter registration from Huduma number, or sometimes even the cash transfer program. So, and I guess there's been minimal efforts from the government in terms of civic education around these things. Even sometimes when I ask people, you know, about their age, they say, do you want to recruit us into some program or something like that? So they ask their younger kin to kind of retrieve their ID cards, because they think that I am, you know, some kind of local officer who's trying to recruit them into some cash program. But of course, I made this clear that I wasn't, and I was just doing it for research purpose. But it just tells you, like, the kind of different settings in which ID cards have become important. And now, I don't think 80, 70-year-olds sometimes differentiate between these things. They just say, it's just what the government wants, and they produce it whenever it's required. That's partly why they call it the government age, and not their own age. So they say, do you want my government age? Then they check out their ID card. So yeah, I mean, I don't know whether, I mean, people, older people especially, have any, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to exclude them, but at least in my experience, they don't seem to differentiate between Huduma number from all these other kind of recruitment programs.
So Dale follows up with a comment and a question, which I'll read, which I think is related to this issue of how people think about the cards and the effects on subjectivity and so on. So the comment is, thanks for the very enlightening talk. We see an emergence of practices like ID cards often being discarded at the grave when the bearer dies. The state requires that it be surrendered. At the end, the bearers or their surviving relatives conceive of the IDs as a property of their departed person. It's interesting dynamics how people relate to the ID. Then the question is, do traditional Bharanas you spoke of think of IDs as necessary and important, or just an unavoidable government nuisance?
Yeah, thanks again, Dale. I mean, yeah, when we talk about subjectivities, there are also kind of cultural beliefs about things, right? So in Marsabit, among the Boran and many other groups, so if somebody dies, they usually say, you know, they have to be forgotten. I mean, they pull down pictures from walls of Kante, like having any sort of memories of the departed. So they kind of remove any semblance of this person from the public view. And so there's a kind of a direct editing out of people from, you know, even albums. Sometimes when you go to people's places, I mean, we have a culture where you used to turn up at somebody's house, and as you wait for the tea, you know, as a guest, they give you the family album. I don't know whether it happens in other parts of the world, but it's like just something to read or to look at as you wait for whatever you're waiting for, tea or mostly tea. But you kind of see sometimes when you go through them, people even cut out images of people who have died. Or just, you know, you see spaces, and these spaces sometimes mean a lot. I mean, you don't ask out of, you know, I mean, you don't want to be a bad guest by poking, your nose into people's affairs by asking why this person was cut out and so on. But it serves the purpose. Like if somebody dies, then you take out their stuff, including these photos I'm talking about. I guess that happens with the ID as well. I'm not sure. I've never heard of people kind of throwing them away or at the grave or something like that. But usually there's this kind of, archiving, if you want to put it that way. But these days, I mean, you don't, because you need the death certificate from the government. So these things are not only useful or are not relevant only for the dead. I mean, you need it to prove that your father died and so on and so forth. There are a lot of cases of inheritance issues, suits of different kinds. And so I think it's more and more people tend to put these files in safe places these days, unlike they used to. On IDs is one of them. So yeah, thanks for raising the issue of the cultural beliefs about these things.
I wanted to ask one more question about the subjectivity angle of your paper, and that is about the focus on. I mean, you're talking about ages, and the thing that you're focusing on in the ID cards is ages. So it makes sense that you're addressing the temporality angle on subjectivity. But I'm just wondering if in your project, or just thinking about not just IDs, but also how people navigate the presence of government through documents and other ways in which states make people legible and so on, whether you can think about other dimensions of subjectivity besides temporality. I mean, the one that often is paired with temporality is space, but I'm just wondering whether it's about space or other aspects of other aspects of subjectivity. Are there ways besides the temporal that you ran into in your research that you could say something about?
Right, yeah, so this is just a fraction of the kind of things that I have navigated to get to this point. So, of course, space is a big issue as well, because, you know, most of northern Kenya, I mean, is inhabited by pastoralists. So, livelihoods are predicated on movement and use of space. So people move to particular, areas during, different seasons, depending on availability of rain, pasture. So the way people use space is very important for that kind of practical livelihood purposes, but also for ritual reasons. So people move to particular mountains or particular shrines, even particular wells to conduct certain types of rituals at different times of the year. So there's a whole ritual calendar. That is temporal, of course. It's based on the lunar or solar calendar, mostly lunar. And so the Gabra, for example, have all kinds of jila where they move to ritual villages and so on. So the way space is used is tied to the temporal. Because of the nature of the society. But what if, this kind of ideal movement and, use of space is interrupted? So what if people are forced to live in a particular place? And that's what essentially the state came in and did, is to restrict movement in a process that has been studied, extensively, called sedentarization, where pastoralists are settled into villages, encouraged to farm and become good citizens, because citizenship is also tied to farming. There's a kind of sedentary bias in the way the state looks at these things. So people remember, during the Shifter War, for example, a lot of people are villagized into these villages, government villages. And so they couldn't move. And so when they talk about that time, they say it's the time of stop. In the local parlance, they say it's Gaf Aba. When people are stopped, life kind of essentially stopped because people stopped moving. So there's that aspect of movement. I mean, that has been done by other people. And so I don't really want to kind of reproduce this in my own work, even though, of course, in my interviews, it was a very ubiquitous sort of concept But yeah, I mean, I'm more interested in the temporal aspect rather than the space part of it. But yeah, your question is on the spot. Space and time is kind of tied, not just in anthropological literature, but also in some of the empirical material that I was able to gather.
Well, Hassan, I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A box right now. So
That's
we're getting close to the time anyway, but I just want to thank you again. It's really terrific work. I mean, I'm so pleased that Alia suggested that we invite you, and I look forward to seeing not only your dissertation, but all the great stuff you're going to publish. And hopefully once we get past this pandemic, we can invite you to Brown in person sometime. I'd really like to do that.
You've piled a lot of pressure, and well, hopefully we'll see publications in not too long a time.
I don't think it's going to be long at all. You're doing great work, and it was really a pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.